Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as the director of both the museum here in Grand Rapids and the library in Ann Arbor. We're very pleased to have you with us tonight for this first program of the winter season. We had a really wonderful array of speakers in the fall, and we have a robust series of programs coming up. And since I'm not going to be doing the close of the program tonight, I would like to give you some highlights of upcoming programs so you can be marking your calendars to spend lots of time with us in the month of February. Looking ahead to Wednesday, February 8th, we are opening a new exhibit on Bob Hope, and our speaker will be none other than Zachary Hope, who is the grandson of Bob and Dolores Hope. So that should be a really fun opening of the exhibit. The week after that, on Monday the 13th of February, we're screening a new documentary called Black and Blue, which describes President Ford's friendship and courageous support of a man named Willis Ward, a black teammate on the U of M football team in 1934, which had some interesting experiences in the game against Georgia Tech. Willis Ward later became a very respected judge in Detroit, and we're going to be hosting his grandson, Buzz Thomas, who's a former state senator here in Michigan, and the film producer, Brian Kruger. So do plan to come see that. The film is wonderful. It's about an hour long, and they'll be here to answer questions, and it's really a wonderful insight into President Ford and his character and integrity at a very early age. Following that, on Monday, February 20th, we're going to have the annual Essay Challenge Awards, and the keynote speaker will be Gloria Lara of the Girl Scouts. And on February 21st, John Miller will be discussing his book, The Big Scrum, How Teddy Roosevelt Saved Football. And that's really important that you know all about that just after the Super Bowl. So we look forward to having you at one or hopefully all of those programs. Tonight's program is brought to you with the support of the National Archives and Records Administration, which is our parent organization, in partnership with the Ford Presidential Foundation and the World Affairs Council. I'd like to recognize and express our appreciation for this support to Joe Calvaruso, the Foundation's Executive Director, and Dixie Anderson, who's Executive Director of the World Affairs Council. Joe and Dixie, take a bow, please. We truly could not do what we do in terms of public programs and exhibits without this ongoing support of the Ford Presidential Foundation, and in this case, it's wonderful to have the World Affairs Council back with us again. It's been a little while. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, let me share a little bit of history of the museum's interesting relationship with the Office of the Consul General of Canada in this region. After President Ford passed away, Roy Norton's predecessor, Robert Noble, contacted us to send us, or to deliver to us, a large 8 by 14 foot banner that had hung outside the Canadian Embassy in Washington on Pennsylvania Avenue during the time of the funeral. The banner featured a photo of President Ford with the words, "Farewell, friend, adieu, ami." The presentation of that banner here at the museum was the beginning of a collaboration with the Consul General, which we're continuing this evening, and we're very appreciative of that relationship. Introducing our speaker tonight will be Dixie Anderson, who has been the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of West Michigan for the past amazing 17 years. For those not familiar with this organization, it's a nonprofit group with the sole mission of providing education regarding American foreign policy and global issues. Under Dixie's vibrant leadership, the World Affairs Council has grown from, would you believe, 150 members to more than 1,000 currently. In co-sponsoring an event like this, it's really wonderful that the missions of the Ford Museum, the Ford Foundation, and the World Affairs Council converge, and we're really honored to have this opportunity to collaborate tonight. Finally, before Dixie comes up to introduce our speaker, would you please be sure your cell phones are turned off, as well as all other electronic devices. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dixie Anderson to introduce our speaker. Dixie?
We have council members here tonight, so would you all just wave your hands so we can see? Oh, I know there's more than, yeah. I knew we were about a third of the audience. Come on. Mark Murray, did you raise your hand? Yeah. our members here this evening join me in saying the World Affairs Council has collaborated with the Gerald R. Ford Museum on programming since the museum's inception. So we want to acknowledge that, and we want to say thank you to Elaine Didier and Jim Kratzis of the museum, as well as to Joe Calvaruso, of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation. You know, it's been a great partnership, so thank you. We're honored to be with you. Now, usually when we host a visitor from another country, I always ask the audience, well, how many of you have been to that country? I'm not even going to bother with that tonight. We have all been to Canada. In fact, some of us, including myself, may not have been to all of our sister 50 states, but we've all been to our northern cousin. In fact, I bet there are men in the audience who have some loonies in their pocket or some other Canadian money. And we all have our favorite donut at Tim Hortons. Back in the day, border crossings are not quite as easy now, but back in the day, when I used to visit friends up in the Sioux, Michigan, we used to just zip across the bridge and go into the Sioux, Canada to go to a little Chinese restaurant. Did it you just do it every day, just go back and forth. I see my Broadway plays in Toronto instead of New York. I wear clothes by a Canadian designer. We buy Seagrams. And none of us will want to admit this, and I do know people, I do know people who buy Cuban cigars in Canada because we can't buy them here. And really, I think two of the world's greatest cities are Toronto and Vancouver. I think particularly Michigan, of all our 50 states, feels that we enjoy the strongest and the most easygoing friendship with Canada. So let me introduce a good friend. Originally from Ottawa, Consul General Roy Norton graduated from Carleton University, Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and he has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, which we know as SAIS. Roy has served his country since the 1980s, and he has been the Consul General of Canada based in Detroit for a little over a year and a half. He represents Canada in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. His previous position was in the Canadian Embassy in Washington, where his main responsibility was the Canadian government's relationships with the U.S. Congress. I bet that wasn't an easy job. It is a personal pleasure and a real honor for me to present to you Consul General Norton.
Just in case you're in any doubt, I was responsible for our relations with Congress. I wasn't responsible for Congress. Thank you, Dixie. The World Affairs Council of West Michigan is renowned. I think it's truly one of the largest in the country, unless I'm mistaken, and it's a great honor to speak at a forum that the World Affairs Council has been responsible in part for convening, in collaboration, of course, with the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum here in Grand Rapids. This is my 6th visit to Grand Rapids since I became Consul General 16 months ago. My 13th visit to West Michigan in that period of time. And I'm deeply honored to be able to be with you on the 175th birthday of Michigan. Dixie had suggested earlier today to me in an email that maybe I'd want to sing happy birthday to you. I can't carry a tune, so suffice it that I've wished you happy birthday. Our country by contrast or comparison, is only 144 years old. So we will continue to look to Michigan for the wisdom and the guidance that one looks to one's elders for. Relative, in fact, to much of the world, we're both young countries, the United States and Canada. Your history as a nation began in revolution against the United Kingdom 236 years ago this year. And 200 years ago this coming June, you declared war on the United Kingdom, effectively on us. The War of 1812 to 14 was fought exclusively in North America. It forged a Canadian identity, if not yet a Canadian nation. For you, that war cleared the path for settlement of the upper Midwest, including Michigan. Now, histories of the relationship, at least those written in Canada, are replete with metaphors of elephants, that's you, and mice, that's us, sharing a continent. You catch a cold, we get pneumonia. You get the picture. You roll over, anyway. If you don't already know this, I'll let you in on a closely guarded secret. Canadians are obsessed with the United States. Most of us fully understand that as a superpower, you have many obligations and you can't necessarily be quite so preoccupied with Canada as what we are with you. But it's a welcome opportunity for me as a Canadian diplomat to have a captive audience for an hour and to, during the course of that hour, talk a little bit about the relationship between Canada and the United States, one that's very vital to us and we think important to you. From the Canadian perspective, almost everything about our development as a country has happened in recognition of the United States reality. In this, we, in a sense, led the rest of the world by considerably more than 100 years. Decisions taken here affected us long before they affected the rest of the world at the point at which you became the world superpower. And I must assure you that Canadians wouldn't have it any other way. We wouldn't want to be anywhere else on this planet other than where we are. We're very glad that it's with you that we share a 5,000-mile border. We're very glad it's with you that we've been able to develop and secure this continent over these 235 years. Now, I've titled this address, you saw the invitation, The First 235 Years of Canada-U.S. Relations in an Hour. Implicitly, we anticipate a second 235 years and a third. I'm going to take pretty much a full hour. I'll take my watch off now just to time myself and see how disciplined I am, to present the highlights of those first 235 years. I should say at this point that if you aren't in the habit of attending hour-long history lectures, to the extent to which this presentation is occasioned by the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, you're not likely to have to do this for another 100 years or so. So sit back and make yourselves comfortable. Generations of Canadians, this is kind of a self-indulgent thing, have come to regard and describe my country as the peaceable kingdom. Now, we Canadians do a lot of comparing and contrasting. Guess who is the perennial benchmark? Of course, in the 1770s, residents of the 13 colonies regarded British Quebec, which included this very spot, as anything but peaceable. Your Declaration of Independence sought life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it was from us, my British ancestors, that you were seeking, from them, that you were seeking liberty. It's a measure of the essential pragmatism of our populations that we've been able, over the course of the ensuing period, to develop a relationship at all, let alone such a good one. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended the Revolutionary War, but some issues lingered. The Jay Treaty of 1795 largely resolved them. Suspicions did linger, however. Pulitzer Prize winner Alan Taylor's magisterial book out last year, called The Civil War of 1812, American Citizens, British Subjects, Irish Rebels, and Indian Allies, chronicles what happened next to the relationship. The War of 1812, as I said, was formative for Canadians, in many respects the same as the Revolutionary War was for Americans. Outnumbered in population 10-1 at the time, we fought you to a draw. You burned our capital at York, which is now Toronto. We burned the White House. Perhaps most importantly, at the war's end, what is essentially Michigan today was in Canadian hands. Now, had that held, I might today be governor. But I certainly wouldn't be Canada's consul general to Michigan. Of course, it didn't hold. In the Treaty of Ghent of 1814, the peace treaty that ended the War of 1812, Britain essentially relinquished the territorial gains that it had made. So did the Americans. Canadians learned something in that process about the colonial power, the United Kingdom, which was then the world superpower, and about national interest. The geopolitical priority of good relations with the United States was as important then to the United Kingdom as it is to Canada and to most countries today. That recurring theme of the importance of good relations with the United States really has underpinned the ensuing 200 years of our shared history. One outcome of the War of 1812 was the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, limiting the number of battleships on the Great Lakes to 8. Now, its terms remain in effect today. I might ask, however, when did you last see one battleship on the Great Lakes? President Monroe's 1823 doctrine, stating that further efforts by European countries to colonize land or interfere with countries in the Americas would be regarded as aggression requiring U.S. intervention, may or may not have been formulated with the northern part of this continent in mind. But it certainly engendered fears in Canada. Would relations between our jurisdictions henceforth be conducted under the guise of America's desire for hemispheric hegemony? The specter of another possible U.S. invasion certainly motivated the construction between 1826 and 1832 of the 100-mile-long Rideau Canal system connecting Kingston, Ontario, Lake Ontario, to what would later become Ottawa, Canada's capital. During winter, when the 6 miles of that canal that run through the city of Ottawa are now converted to the world's longest skating rink, residents could usefully reflect on how grateful they should be to the perceived threat of another U.S. invasion. Short-lived rebellions in 1837 in both Lower Canada, later Quebec, and Upper Canada, later Ontario, kept the fears alive. Republicanism briefly held sway in York, now Toronto, and in Montreal. That some of the attacks were launched from the United States reinforced Canadian paranoia. The British government responded with the Act of Union of 1841. It sought to bring greater coherence to central Canadian governance. It sought to address serious fiscal imbalances on the principle that a profligate colony could be a more vulnerable colony. And it sought to strengthen Britain's hold on Canada. Government in the colony had to be better equipped, on the one hand, to fend off any further rebelliousness, and on the other hand, to prevent any further incursions from the south. The advent of U.S. Manifest Destiny in the 1840s, which was used to justify the 1846 war with Mexico, did nothing to allay ongoing Canadian fears of vulnerability. Now, Canadian business interests, meanwhile, were growing in their recognition that the United States going forward likely constituted a more natural and probably more profitable market than the United Kingdom itself. In 1848, leaders of the Montreal business community, which at the time was Canada's largest, proclaimed an annexation manifesto calling for nothing less than full commercial union with the United States. This led in 1854 to a reciprocity treaty between the British North American colonies and the United States, with each side removing duties on a lengthy list of mostly agricultural products and natural resources. Reciprocal access was provided quite extensively to North American fisheries. British and American shipping had access under the terms of the Reciprocity Treaty to the St. Lawrence River, the Canadian canals, and to Lake Michigan. Trade more than doubled over the next 10 years. Whether precisely as a result of reciprocity or not, we'll never know for sure. This region was booming at the time. Railways were being constructed in the US Midwest, and of course there was huge demand created by your Civil War. Now, some accuse Britain of having been an ambivalent observer during that war, or maybe even worse. That can't be said of Canada. We were regarded by both sides as potential guns for hire, but overwhelmingly, Canadians fought on the Union side, perhaps as many as 50,000 of us. Notwithstanding lingering suspicions about the Republic and its intentions, as many as 100,000 Canadians were drawn to the course of individual liberty in the United States because, in part, as many as 100,000 American slaves had fled via the Underground Railway to Canada in the decade from 1850 to 1860, with the principal destination being Windsor, the city at the other end of the Ambassador Bridge, more specifically to Sandwich, the longest settled community in Canada, west of Montreal. Ironically, as demand and business opportunity grew, US companies became more protectionist. This may be a recurring phenomenon. The US government abrogated the 1854 Reciprocity Treaty in 1866. Apprehension that victorious Union Army soldiers might decide to turn its attention northwards, exacerbated by raids on several Canadian locations in 1866 by the Fenians, a group of radical Irish Americans centered in New York, provoked another bout of Canadian fear and introspection. This time, however, we decided enough was enough of this recurring paranoia. We were going to do something about it, so we formed a country. And in 1867, the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia came together, still under British sovereignty, and created the Dominion of Canada. The rallying cry wasn't life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, however. The Canadian counterpart, enshrined in the British North America Act of 1867, which remained our Constitution until 29 years ago, is peace, order, and good government. Now, it's just possible that in those two alternative phrases, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on the one hand, peace, order, and good government on the other, that you can derive much of what you need to know about the differences between American and Canadian thinking. It worked, perhaps due to the prowess we then projected as a unified geography, or maybe due to exhaustion and your need to be preoccupied with Reconstruction. You didn't turn around and invade Canada. Canadian Confederation, causally or coincidentally, we can't be sure, pretty much marks the point at which Canada's relations with the United States no longer were driven by the fear that Canada might have to fight a defensive war for national survival. The other recurring theme during these 235 years, the extent to which governments would facilitate or constrain economic relations between the two countries, was in no way resolved in the mid-1860s. Notwithstanding the 1854 Reciprocity Treaty, disputes erupted with some frequency between the US and Canada, especially pertaining to fisheries. In fact, there's rarely been a time since US independence when there's not been a fisheries dispute of greater or lesser magnitude, hardly surprising given the vast coastal and inland waters that our two countries share, and the difficulty in drawing and agreeing on boundaries. Parenthetically, we have a small handful of lingering boundary disputes to this day, the largest being over an area the size of Connecticut in the Beaufort Sea northeast of Alaska. With abrogation of the Reciprocity Treaty, the option of closer economic relations between our countries was effectively taken off the table, for the time being, anyway. So the attentions of the newly formed nation, ours, turned westward. In this, Canada acted much as the United States did or had. Each of us had other fish to fry. The opportunity of westward expansion, in a sense, was a welcome distraction for both of us. In Canada's case, settling the West also had a defensive element. If you settled your West, and we didn't, the specter of American northward movement might rear its head again. And so during the last decades of the 19th century and the first of the 20th, Canada embarked on a period of national consolidation. The provinces of Prince Edward Island, Manitoba, British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan joined our confederation. Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first prime minister, our George Washington except in the military sense, served as head of government for 19 years between 1867 and 1891. In 1879, his government introduced its national policy, as it was called. It was a policy with three pillars: building the Transcontinental Railway, the Canadian Pacific Railway, attracting immigrants to settle the West, and third, protection of infant Canadian industries with high tariffs. The Liberal opposition in Canadian politics at the time, centered to a great extent in southwestern Ontario, continued to believe that free trade with the United States offered a better model for Canadian development. They were cautious, however. This issue lent itself to demagoguery. Political parties shifted positions on trade liberalization over the course of the next century. Macdonald, the author of Protectionism, actually found himself accused during Canada's 1891 election of wanting to amalgamate Canada with the United States. His famous response, a British subject I was born, a British subject I will die. True to his word, he died a British subject 3 months later. His Liberal opponent in that campaign, Quebecer Wilfrid Laurier, endorsed unrestricted reciprocity, or free trade, with the United States. Some American politicians publicly embraced Laurier's idea, touting it as the forerunner to inevitable political union. That pretty much proved to be the kiss of death in Canada for free trade for the next 20 years, until 1911, when Laurier, who had become Prime Minister in 1896, was waging his final campaign. He advocated strongly in that election for free trade. Robert Borden, his Conservative challenger, opposed free trade with the United States and advocated for a Canadian Navy. The pre-World War I years had been marked by a European naval race. The question for Canadians at the time, which somewhat divided the country along linguistic lines, was whether or not we should build our own Navy, thereby not only relieving the Royal Navy of obligations on this side of the Atlantic, but perhaps positioning Canada to tangibly contribute in the event of European wars. Laurier's government was resoundingly defeated in that 1911 free trade election. It would be another 77 years before free trade with the United States would dominate a Canadian election battle. Then, in a switch, it would be the Conservatives proposing it and the Liberals fighting against it. Both times, even though they took opposite positions on the issue, it was the Conservatives who won. Now, the election of 1911 came just 2 years after the conclusion of the Boundary Waters Treaty, which created the International Joint Commission. Don't infer from any of the Canadian schizophrenia that I've implied that we're incapable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. It's possible, on the one hand, to worry in a free trade relationship with a country 13 times as populous as yours that your industry might flee if you were to engage in a free trade agreement, while on the other hand being pragmatically disposed to binational arrangements of equality, in this case regulating boundary waters in the mutual interest of the two countries. Absolutely key to the success of the IJC model from Canada's perspective is that it is an institution in which there is no asymmetric power relationship. The US and Canada enjoy equal weight. Their biennial meeting, the most recent one, took place in Detroit this October for the first time ever in conjunction with the annual meetings of two other binational fora, the Great Lakes Commission and the Healing Our Waters Coalition. Back to my chronology. Canada's newly constituted Navy, the one that Robert Borden had called for in 1911, didn't have to wait long before the opportunity to make a seminal contribution. Great Britain entered World War I on August 4th, 1914, Canada 1 day later. The United States posture of neutrality ended in April of 1917 with Congress's declaration of war. World War I changed many things for Canada. On one level, it represented another coming of age. With a population at the time 1/13, that of the United States, Canada suffered more than half as many military deaths in that war as what the United States did. Convinced on the battlefields of Europe and the seas around it that Canada had transitioned from colony to nation, Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden insisted on a separate seat for Canada at the Paris Peace Conference. Not only did Britain initially oppose that proposition, so did the United States. Canada was seen in the United States as a likely extra British vote, as it were. Britain's last Liberal Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, ultimately acquiesced and persuaded the reluctant Americans to do so as well. Apart from Great Britain, delegations from Canada, India, Australia, Newfoundland, New Zealand, and South Africa were all seated. But World War I was about much more than countries coming of age. It also represented, for us anyway, a changing of the guard. The case can pretty much be made that post-World War I, the world had a new superpower, you. Canada, Australia, and India all saw themselves less and less as colonies, and the mother country, Britain, was broke. The UK had become massively indebted to the United States in order to be able to prosecute the war. For the first time, the United States found itself as creditor to the former colonial master. Its territory unscathed by the war, with much of Europe in rubble, the American century, or centuries, had been launched. Canada could not be impervious to these developments. Canadian prime ministers from World War I onwards paid much more attention to the United States than they did to the United Kingdom. This constituted a real change. Not yet formally responsible for the conduct of our own international relations, Britain continued to discharge that responsibility on our behalf until the Statute of Westminster of 1931. Nonetheless, Canada opened a legation office in Washington in 1926, our first ever diplomatic mission abroad, and the United States reciprocated the same year, opening one in Ottawa. The 1920s were a period of post-war prosperity in both of our countries. In yours, of course, it was also the time of Prohibition. From 1920 to 1933, Canadians honed a capacity to provide quick and quality response to American commercial needs. Mackenzie King, the longest serving prime minister in Canada's history, led our country for almost 23 of the 27 years from 1921 to 1948. He was a Harvard PhD who subsequently worked 4 years for the Rockefeller Foundation in New York City. Previous prime ministers had generally been educated in Great Britain. King personified the shift in Canada's mindset. His time in office closely overlapped that of your longest serving president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The two worked extremely closely together. King embraced many of FDR's New Deal policies to combat the Great Depression in Canada, and they collaborated tightly in prosecuting World War II. As in the case of the First Great War, Canada entered early, although this time we waited 2 weeks after Britain's declaration of war. Again, Canada was on the battlefield in the high seas more than 2 years before the United States entered. But barely months into the war, and well before Pearl Harbor, fears grew, including in Canada, that Britain could fall to the Nazis. Prime Minister King wasn't alone in projecting that Canada might then have become a next target. He met with President Roosevelt in Ogdensburg, New York, on the St. Lawrence River in August of 1940. There they announced the creation of the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, a body that in its permanence obviously was being created to outlast the crisis represented by World War II. Historians understand that the idea was President Roosevelt's and that Prime Minister King readily agreed. The agreement put in place much closer Canadian-American military cooperation than had previously pertained. The board became the senior advisory body on continental security. It exists to this day and comprises 2 national sections made up of diplomatic and military representatives. Quebec City provided the venue in August 1943 for a highly secret military conference, codenamed Quadrant, between the British, US, and Canadian governments. President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Prime Minister King represented their respective countries. Planning began there for the invasion of France, codenamed Overlord. There was discussion of increased bombing of Germany and of the buildup of US forces in Britain prior to an invasion of France. So aligned did our two countries emerge from World War II that President Truman's observation in 1947 to the effect that, and I'm quoting here, Canada and the United States have now reached the point where we can no longer think of each other as foreign countries, apparently failed to offend even resolute Canadian nationalists, those who perennially define Canadian identity in relation to the United States. Seeds of US-Canadian defense cooperation that blossomed during World War II led directly to full Canadian participation in the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949, and of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, in 1958, likely the most important military agreement in which Canada is part to this day. Our two countries fought alongside one another on the UN force in Korea, further cementing military bonds between us, And those bonds, I think it's safe to say, have only grown since. There are 4 countries with which the United States is comfortable sharing almost all intelligence and the status of military planning, Canada foremost among them. And we continue to turn to the United States to meet most of our major defense procurement needs. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, your new, highly articulate young president, came to Ottawa in 1961 and spoke to our parliament. There he pronounced on the U.S.-Canada relationship, and I'll quote him, "Those whom nature hath so joined together, let no man put asunder." This notwithstanding the fact that the government of his Canadian counterpart, John Diefenbaker, would drive the U.S. to distraction through indecision on whether or not to allow U.S. nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. Relations at the top improved for a time with the election of Lester Pearson and his Liberal Party to government in 1963. However, Vietnam proved a challenge. Despite official U.S. requests, Canada did not enter that war, although more than 5,000 Canadians did enlist in the U.S. military in order to fight as individuals. In fact, Prime Minister Pearson took the extraordinary step during a speech at Philadelphia's Temple University in 1965 of voicing his support for a pause in the American bombing of North Vietnam so that a diplomatic solution to the crisis might unfold. The Johnson administration erupted. Even before Pearson had finished his speech, he was summoned to Camp David to meet with the president the next day. Johnson, as you know, was well known for his earthiness. He reportedly grabbed Pearson by the lapels and shouted, "Don't you come into my living room and piss on my rug." Now, forgive the vernacular. I'm only going to be a bit risque twice tonight in my choice of language. Both times I'm quoting U.S. presidents, which I guess makes it all right, eh? The two worked hard to repair the relationship. Generously, President Johnson helped open the World's Fair in Montreal in 1967, saying, quote, "We of the United States consider ourselves blessed. We have much to give thanks for, but the gift of providence we cherish most is that we were given as our neighbors on this wonderful continent, the people and the nation of Canada." In this, he laid the groundwork for the pronouncement on October 18th last year by the USA's current ambassador to Canada, David Jacobson, who said, "I am here to tell you that the United States is unbelievably lucky to have Canada as our neighbor." Geographic determinists take heart. Physical proximity and the fact that we aren't some other country, say the USSR or Russia, on your northern border can overcome almost any diplomatic bump in the road. David Jones, a recently retired U.S. diplomat formerly posted to Ottawa, wrote last fall, quote, "Beset as we are with multiple domestic and international challenges, northern tranquility is a gift that needs no examination." Now, Canadian diplomats, of course, could say none of this, but we sure love it when we can quote Americans who do. Vietnam was seminal in shaping the individual attitudes of many Canadians towards the United States. An estimated 30,000 or more Dodgers of the U.S. draft took up residence in Canada. Given the circumstances of their departure from your country, most spent the rest of their lives in mine. Many achieved positions of prominence in Canadian media, sharing thereafter with Canadian audiences their perceptions of American leadership and its role in the world. Anyone here remember Pierre Trudeau? Okay. He was Canada's third longest serving prime minister, more than 15 years between 1968 and 1984. It's likely the case that neither he nor Richard Nixon was inherently inclined to warm to the other. They held substantially different worldviews. Trudeau disagreed with U.S. Cold War policies. At a press conference in 1971, he opined that the United States posed, quote, "a danger to our," meaning Canadian, "national identity from a cultural, economic, and perhaps even military point of view." Subsequently, President Nixon was quoted referring to Trudeau as "that asshole." That's the second one, to which Trudeau replied, "I've been called worse things by better people." Nixon nonetheless came to Canada the next year at Trudeau's invitation. He spoke to Parliament, much as John Kennedy had done in 1961, and he declared the vaunted, quote, special relationship between Canada and the United States to be dead. He said, and I quote, "It's time for us to recognize that we have very separate identities, that we have significant differences, and that nobody's interests are furthered when these realities are obscured." Now, it's important, pretty sobering for Canadians at the time. The special relationship is pretty special to us. But nonetheless, it's important to emphasize that even when the personal relationship between the US and Canadian leaders wasn't warm, business got done. There simply are too many things to manage when you share a continent, as we do. So during the visit in which President Nixon made his remarks to Parliament, he and Prime Minister Trudeau signed the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Some of you may recall that in the 1960s in particular, Ohio's Cuyahoga River perpetually caught on fire. It was a sign that Lake Erie in particular wasn't healthy. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, updated in 1987 and about to be revised and renewed once again, has contributed significantly to the revival of the Great Lakes, perhaps most particularly to Lake Erie. Its existence is but one measure of the determination and the ability of America's and Canada's governments to engage in practical problem solving, even during those times when their leaders aren't especially friendly with one another. Now, apart from Vietnam, or maybe because of Vietnam, this was a time of growing Canadian nationalism, meaning it was a period in which many members of Canada's political elite were in overdrive, taking every opportunity to distinguish our country from yours. A book dating from the mid-1960s, George Grant's Lament for a Nation, The Defeat of Canadian Nationalism, was a touchstone for this movement. Rothstein and Lax, both on the Canadian left, issued Independence, the Canadian Challenge, in 1972. Trudeau almost lost his first re-election bid, that year. As a result, he became dependent for a majority in Parliament on Canada's Social Democrats, the NDP. This led to the creation the following year of the Foreign Investment Review Agency, a body designed to examine with skepticism foreign investment coming into Canada, if you can believe it. Of course, overwhelmingly, the investment that was being subjected to examination was American. Pierre Trudeau won his third election campaign in July of 1974 with a majority government this time, meaning he was no longer dependent on the left-leaning NDP. A number of policy changes resulted. Just 1 month later, Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace. I can find no record of any public comment made by Trudeau on that occasion. Thank God for Gerald Ford. Your 38th president knew Canada well, having traveled to my country many times. It would appear that he was much more relaxed about Pierre Trudeau than Richard Nixon had been. And with the benefit of 6 years in office, perhaps Trudeau had become less inclined to gratuitous provocation of the United States. The first G5 summit, the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, and France, took place in France in 1975. French President Giscard invited Italy to attend, although it was not officially a member. President Ford reportedly was irate at Canada's exclusion. Giscard reportedly was adamant on the subject. The US hosted the second summit, President Ford did, the following year, and President Ford invited Pierre Trudeau. From that point forward, the G5 became the G7, with both Italy and Canada as formal members. Hark back for a moment to the post-World War I peace conference. The US didn't want Canada there, convinced we'd be just another British vote. In 1975, the French didn't want Canada to be a G-whatever member, likely convinced we'd be just another US vote. The British secured our participation at Paris. President Ford secured our participation in the G7 from 1976 onwards. Our orbital migration was complete. A personal aside, I was minister at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, responsible for congressional relations and public affairs, as Elaine has, or as Dixie noted, among other things, when President Ford died the day after Christmas in 2006. And the banner to which Dr. Didier referred was a banner that I was responsible for commissioning to hang on on the side of our embassy. If you've ever been to our embassy in Washington, you know that we're very well located, just opposite the West Wing on Pennsylvania Avenue, opposite the West Wing of the National Gallery. The banner hung there to pay tribute to President Ford and the relations that we enjoyed during his presidency. And then we shipped it to Robert Noble, my predecessor if you think there's a circularity in the Canadian Foreign Service, you would be correct in this case. We shipped it to Detroit to my predecessor, Robert Noble, who then brought it on February 27th of 2007 here to the museum. Coming full circle, we're still engaged in circularity. 1 year ago, I came here to the museum, my first trip here, and I visited the banner in its new home in the archives immediately below us. Now, arguably, Gerald Ford was the only U.S. president with whom Pierre Trudeau did get along. President Carter was the only U.S. president since before the Great Depression never to visit Canada while he was in office. In other words, this isn't about partisanship. Jimmy Carter evidently found Pierre Trudeau's lecturing the United States on its management of the free world to be as irritating as what Richard Nixon had and as what Ronald Reagan would. But Trudeau had been replaced briefly, coincident with President Carter's greatest foreign policy crisis, the seizure by Iranian radicals of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran on November 4th, 1979. Several U.S. diplomats and their spouses managed to escape that day to the Canadian Embassy. We secluded them for almost 3 months, equipping them with Canadian identities and passports that made it possible for them to board a plane to Switzerland at the end of January of 1980. This operation, which obviously involved great personal risk to everyone on the ground, was overseen by Canada's first female foreign minister, the Honourable Flora MacDonald, and by my former boss, then Prime Minister, Joe Clark. Clark had beaten Trudeau that May in an election. His minority government lasted only 9 months, however, before losing the rubber match to Pierre Trudeau in February of 1980. Clark, like Brian Mulroney, who became Prime Minister in 1984, had fought his election partly on the issue of the need to restore good relations with the United States. This theme often recurs in Canadian campaigns. I'll reference it again. The final Trudeau term corresponded with President Reagan's first. There was little chemistry between the two leaders. A vast ideological gulf separated them. Canadian public opinion undoubtedly reinforced Pierre Trudeau's personal opinions, making him less disposed to try to solve any issues that might have required compromise on his part. This phenomenon also is a recurring one. Prime Minister Chrétien, in office from 1993 to 2004, likely found it easier to reverse himself on his 1993 campaign opposition to NAFTA because it was Bill Clinton in the end who was asking him to do so. Canadians, you see, loved Bill Clinton. But before there was a NAFTA, which took effect in 1984, there was a US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which took effect in 1989. And before there was a Prime Minister Chrétien, there was indeed a Prime Minister Mulroney. Brian Mulroney beat Pierre Trudeau's successor in 1984, winning the largest majority in Canadian parliamentary history. He campaigned hard in support of an improved Canadian relationship with the United States, even more so than what Joe Clark had done 5 years earlier. As I said, our relations with you periodically feature prominently in Canadian election campaigns. I think I'm glad that the reverse isn't true. Pierre Trudeau had alienated American leaders at least I hope it isn't true. Pierre Trudeau had alienated American leaders in so many ways. Canadians came to conclude that we paid too heavy a price for his indulgences. And it wasn't just at the level of the presidency that we encountered problems. A distinguished former Canadian diplomat and academic, John Holmes, wrote in his 1981 book, Life with Uncle, the Canadian-American relationship, that, quote, Canada, the good ally, got more generous treatment in Congress than a Canada regarded as too friendly with Castro and Mao. Having arrived in Washington for my second tour there, just months after the Harper government came to office in 2006, I can personally attest that members of Congress had an acute sense that the new Canadian government was not trying to score domestic political points off of the United States. They may not have known much else about Canada, but they knew that. and they seemed to think that this represented a change in behavior on our part. Back to 1984. Mulroney was a businessman. For 6 years prior to becoming leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, as it was then known, he had been president of the Iron Ore Company of Canada, a subsidiary of a US multinational. He was a deal maker, and he never met anyone he couldn't charm, including Ronald Reagan. In March of 1985, Reagan visited Canada, Quebec City, in fact, on St. Patrick's Day, no less. There, the two leaders, both of Irish descent, held what came to be known as the Shamrock Summit. On stage, in front of the media, arm in arm, they sang "When Irish Eyes Are Smiling." Brian Mulroney would have accepted Dixie's invitation and sung "Happy 175th Birthday" to you, I'm sure. Canadians who had voted for an improved relationship with the United States certainly got what they were looking for, and quickly at that. Beginning in 1985, and for the remaining years of the Reagan presidency, Mulroney tried to secure from the United States an agreement on acid rain abatement, the phenomenon whereby emissions from industry, principally from coal plants located in the industrial Midwest, traveled north and east via prevailing winds and then brought back to Earth via precipitation, acidified and destroyed forests and lakes in central Canada and the eastern United States. President Reagan would have none of it. The science didn't support the theory, it was asserted. It took the advent of President George H.W. Bush to secure an agreement. As a result, the problem has largely been mitigated. Historically, overt pursuit of good relations with the United States actually has enhanced Canada's scope to disagree with the United States on some important foreign policy issues of the day. So, for example, Brian Mulroney and his foreign minister, former Prime Minister Joe Clark, were global leaders in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. In that, they found themselves on opposite sides from both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And Clark threw himself into the Central American peace process, an issue on which, again, Canada found itself at odds with the United States. Full disclosure, I was Clark's senior policy advisor at the time. South Africa and Central America were among my files, so to speak. The key point for our purposes today is that because no US diplomat posted in Canada at the time could honestly have reported back to Washington that the Mulroney government was disagreeing with the United States on these issues simply for the domestic political benefits in Canada of needling the superpower, something Pierre Trudeau had often been accused of doing, Canada paid no evident price whatsoever in its relations with the United States. On the single issue that came to define the Mulroney government's relationship with the United States, pursuit of a free trade agreement, the Prime Minister's warm personal relations with the President and other key members of the administration were instrumental in overcoming both the inertia and the skepticism with which official Washington often confronts opportunities like that one. A little background. Under Lester Pearson and LBJ, Canada and the United States had entered into what became known as the Auto Pact, short for Automotive Pact, in 1965. Fortunately, this was signed months before Prime Minister Pearson's Temple University speech. The pact greatly benefited the large American car makers. Tariffs on cars, trucks, buses, tires, and auto parts were removed between our two countries. In exchange, the Detroit Three agreed that automobile production in Canada would not fall below 1964 levels, and that they would assure the same production to sales ratio in Canada. This facilitated economies of scale, greatly enhancing industry efficiency. The Auto Pact worked well for both countries. In Canada, it became Exhibit A as to why free trade with the United States should be considered non-threatening. The Central Canadian auto assembly and parts manufacturing business blossomed. In 2010, in fact, more vehicles were assembled in Ontario than in Michigan or any other North American jurisdiction. Now, I'm mindful of where I am at this moment. Michigan's status as the leader in North America's auto industry remains unchallenged. To provide additional reassurance, let me cite a study of 2010 from the prestigious Center for Automotive Research at the University of Michigan, which noted that approximately 60% of the major content, for example, powertrain, of the average car or truck coming off of the assembly line in Canada is in fact of US origin. That's how totally integrated, as a result of supply chain relationships, our two economies have become. Mulroney decided in 1985 to take the plunge. Even though free trade with the United States had not featured in the election that brought him to office, he opted to pursue a deal. effectively confronting for the first time since 1911 what had become a third rail in Canadian politics. A free trade agreement with the United States became for us, I should say, what NAFTA later became for the United States, i.e. a cosmic initiative. In relative terms, NAFTA, 6 years later, was a yawn for Canada. 3 years of hard negotiation ensued from the point at which we decided to embark on this, frequently coming close to failure. The agreement, once reached in 1988, required approval by the Canadian Parliament and the United States Congress. Even with his overwhelming majority in the Canadian House of Commons, Prime Minister Mulroney could not secure parliamentary approval. Our Senate, an appointive body, was still under the control of the Liberal opposition, and it balked. Mulroney called a general election. The issue was free trade. The two opposition parties in that election, 1988, between them won a majority of the popular vote. But Canada, a multi-party parliamentary system, enjoys a first-past-the-post outcome process, district by district, and Mulroney was returned to office. His Progressive Conservative Party was, with a reduced majority of seats. The legislation was reintroduced, this time with the Canadian people having spoken on the specific issue. The Senate capitulated. Another aside, the biggest electoral losses that the Mulroney government suffered in that 1988 election relative to 1984 were in the province of Ontario, our most populous. Interestingly, every Ontario district facing the United States, I mean by that those most proximate to the United States along our water boundaries, that Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives had won in 1984, they lost in 1988 in the free trade election. The much improved Canada-U.S. relationship extended through the administrations of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Brian Mulroney's role in building the coalition in support of the first Gulf War cannot and should not be exaggerated. Not only did Canada contribute in an outsized fashion militarily, but the Prime Minister, with the encouragement and support of President Bush, spent a lot of time on the phone talking to leaders with whom he may have had a stronger rapport than what President Bush did. The modern-day bilingual, English-French, capability of Canadian Prime Ministers can be a big asset. The Prime Minister was instrumental in impressing upon a skeptical French President Mitterrand the importance of a unified effort. France, of course, carries a veto at the UN Security Council, and partly at Canada's urging, the United States had decided to go the Security Council route at that time in terms of seeking approval. Then, if perhaps not as much as now, Venezuela was disinclined to line up behind US leadership. Venezuela also held a temporary seat at the time on the UN Security Council. But Mulroney and then Venezuelan President Carlos Andrés Pérez had worked closely on Haiti, and Mulroney was able to parlay that, it seemed, into Venezuelan acquiescence in the Gulf War. Also contributing to Canada's influence, apart from our membership in the Commonwealth and La Francophonie, two large multilateral organizations of which the United States, of course, can't be a member, was the fact that in 1989, for the first time, Canada became a full member of the Organization of American States. Previous Canadian governments had been paralyzed by fear that if we joined the OAS and echoed the US position there, we would undermine our standing with many other member countries. And conversely, that if we joined and disagreed with the United States at the OAS, we could jeopardize our critical bilateral relationship. Mulroney and Clark believe truly that Canada could walk and chew gum at the same time. They were confident in our relations with the United States, and they felt it was time to rectify the anomaly whereby Canada, the largest country geographically in the hemisphere, wasn't a member of the hemisphere's political organization. In this hemisphere, and elsewhere for that matter, it's normally been to Canada's advantage that we are perceived as enjoying good relations with the United States. It's generally assumed around the world that we're close. When it's evident that we aren't, as was the case for most of the Trudeau era and for a few years under Prime Ministers Chrétien and Martin, our standing elsewhere in the world suffers. The go-between and interpreter roles that Canada often plays can be beneficial to us, to the United States, and to third countries. It disadvantages all parties when we take ourselves out of position to discharge those functions. Canadian electors While perhaps impressed by the influence that Prime Minister Mulroney seemed able to exert on global developments, nonetheless also at the same time place a considerable premium on independence. That is, any Canadian Prime Minister or party that is perceived to become too close to the United States is usually punished. Brian Mulroney retired in June of 1993. There are many reasons why the Progressive Conservative Party under Kim Campbell, his successor as leader and prime minister, suffered a near total electoral annihilation that autumn. But one of the reasons, assuredly, was that Canadians felt the government on which they were passing judgment had become unbalanced in its relations with the United States, just as they had adjudicated on the unbalance under Pierre Trudeau, but in the opposite direction in 1984. Opposition leader Jean Chrétien in that election was provoked to promise during the campaign that unlike Mulroney, he would not be going fishing with the US president. That's something that Mulroney had frequently done with President George H.W. Bush. Canadians embraced the distance from the United States that Chrétien offered. He was elected with a solid majority. And then, when instead of fishing, he became a frequent golfing partner of President Clinton, Canadians seemed not to notice. The rapport that the two honed on the golf course may have contributed to President Clinton's decision to enunciate a stronger US position on the 1995 Quebec referendum on sovereignty than might otherwise have been expected. Jim Blanchard, your former governor, detailed the US role in that referendum campaign in his book, Behind the Embassy Door, Canada, Clinton, and Quebec, written after his term as US ambassador to Canada. The warmth of the Chrétien-Clinton relationship, however, did not extend to President George W. Bush. Prime Minister Chrétien's government, indeed all Canadians, found stunning the rapidity with which the United States-Canada border seized up after 9/11. An efficiently operating border with the United States is critical to our viability as a nation. Canadians died in the World Trade Center. The Canadian deputy commander at NORAD in Colorado Springs happened to be in charge that day, and so was responsible for bringing down all air traffic across North America in the wake of the attacks. More than 230 US-bound planes were landed in Canada that day. Canadian communities housed more than 30,000 passengers headed for the United States for several days. A lot of very close relationships were built during that time. Like you, we felt vulnerable after 9/11, but not particularly to an attack launched from your country. Most Canadians had trouble understanding why Americans felt sufficiently vulnerable to an attack from Canadian soil to warrant seizing up the border between us. Truck and passenger traffic headed into the United States via the Ambassador Bridge was backed up to Chatham, Ontario, 80 miles away. I could get going on the Ambassador Bridge. It's not a daily occurrence that you've got an 80-mile backup. It's just a periodic occurrence. Canadians were bothered by the totally unfounded assertions uttered then and repeated since that some of the hijackers to the United States had come from our country. In 1938, when President Roosevelt inaugurated the Thousand Islands Bridge between Ontario and New York State, he said, and I quote, "This bridge stands as an open door. There will be no challenge at the border and no guard to ask a countersign. Where the boundary is crossed, the entry words must be pass friend." Now, after 9/11, Canadians instinctively knew that pass friend was no longer practicable, and we responded pragmatically. The government proposed to the Bush administration a suite of measures which came to be known as the Smart Border Accord. These were designed to put instruments in place that would give both governments more certainty over who and what was coming across the US-Canada border. It succeeded, but at a cost. Clearly, it is more cumbersome today than it was before 9/11 to cross that border. As a result, the bonds that united millions of citizens in our respective countries are looser today than they had previously been. And the potential to achieve further economic integration has somewhat been compromised. The Chrétien government quickly accepted the Bush administration's request that we join the coalition in Afghanistan. Our fighting role there ended this summer after almost a decade during which we were principally responsible for the coalition's position in Kandahar province in the south on the Pakistani border. We remain as trainers of the Afghan National Army. By contrast, we declined President Bush's invitation to join the coalition of the willing in Iraq. And in one of the worst managed announcements of a policy position certain to irritate the United States, Paul Martin, Prime Minister Chrétien's successor, told the House of Commons in 2005, without giving the United States a heads up, that Canada would not participate in the US missile defense program. The relationship became pretty frosty from that point until Martin's Liberal government was defeated in May of 2006 by Stephen Harper's Conservatives. An efficiently operating border that achieves both countries' security needs has been Prime Minister Harper's greatest bilateral preoccupation since coming to office. We didn't oppose the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, your passport requirement, but we did press hard for it to be implemented only after a critical mass of Canadians and Americans had passports. The Bush administration opposed any delay whatsoever. If asked to identify the single greatest triumph of my most recent Washington posting, it unquestionably would be our success in persuading Congress, in the face of administration opposition, to set the WHTI implementation date back by 18 months. This February, Prime Minister Harper and, as in last February of 2011, Prime Minister Harper and President Obama launched in Washington a Beyond the Border Accord process. Their objective, to find ways through technology and information sharing to push scrutiny away from the actual border to the extent possible. Both countries would like to do more security screening at the perimeter, i.e. before visitors or cargo enter North America, creating scope for greater ease of movement between our countries at the physical border. And we are both committed to achieving a greater degree of regulatory harmonization, thereby eliminating some of the time-consuming complications that confront commerce. On December the 7th, a little bit more than a month ago, again at the White House, the President and Prime Minister released their detailed action plans to drive this beyond the border vision forward toward reality. They are impressive, the action plans are, in their comprehensiveness, with both our governments having identified many significant improvements that can be achieved over the next 2 years. This is, or should be, in our view, at least as important to the United States as it is to us. Canada is the principal export destination for Michigan and for 34 other US states, and of course for the United States as a whole. Half of everything Michigan sells to the world is bought in Canada. Remarkably, the 34 million of us buy more from the United States than the 500 million plus EU residents do. More remarkably, the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, which have a combined population of 21 million, buy more from the United States than you sell to all of the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, put together. Their total population approaches 3 billion. 8 million US jobs depend on trade with Canada, 237,000 of those in the state of Michigan. But the world's largest two-way trade relationship needs constant tending if it's to continue to grow. It grew, the US-Canada one, by more than 20% in 2010, while the Michigan-Canada one grew by 43% in 2010. Tending extends to firm action to remove unnecessary impediments. Infrastructure is one of the critical contributors to such improvement. This has a local context. Canada's #1 national infrastructure priority is a new crossing of the Detroit River at Windsor. This is a subject I've now talked to audiences across Michigan about. I see support here from the union movement. Thank you, Dave, for coming. From the Chamber of Commerce, hosted a forum at which I spoke with the Lieutenant Governor here in early August. Perhaps somebody will want to raise this during question period that's coming right up. Suffice it to say that we hope that Michigan's leaders will soon find a way to make this bridge happen. At his State of the State speech just last week, Governor Snyder reiterated his commitment to getting it done, properly emphasizing the jobs that it will create and the fact that it will cost Michigan nothing. With so many millions of jobs in both of our countries relying on everything working just right every day at one 83-year-old bridge, the employment risks associated with having no alternative option at Detroit-Windsor are simply too great to permit continued inaction. Energy and the environment are also huge priorities for us. We discovered after the Kyoto Protocol was fashioned in 1997 that two countries sharing a continent with heavily integrated economies who are one another's best customers, cannot pursue significantly divergent policies on climate change. We're also committed, consistent with NAFTA's energy chapter, to North American energy integration and, if possible, a possibility that we think is realistic, North American energy self-sufficiency. Guaranteed access to Canadian energy supplies was one of the USA's principal NAFTA objectives. In discharge of that commitment, we've proceeded to develop our resources, which in the case of oil are the world's third largest. In the process, we've become the USA's largest supplier of imported oil, natural gas, electricity, and uranium. We're proximate, reliable, and like-minded. The energy is privately developed, not subject to the capricious development and treatment that government-owned supplies in most OPEC countries suffer. Still, the signals we're getting from the United States administration are not encouraging regarding approval for the multi-billion-dollar proposed Canadian investment in a new oil pipeline that would have the capacity to displace half of your imports from the Middle East, or all of your imports from Venezuela, if you wished. We're still hopeful that the project ultimately will be approved, but we can't help arriving at the conclusion that we must look at alternative energy markets going forward. The Prime Minister will visit China in the second week of February. China's interest in accessing Canadian oil, a long-standing interest, will definitely be a subject of discussion at that time. Now, over the course of this presentation, I've described, which I see is going to last 59 minutes, not 60. Over the course of this presentation, I've described both in detail and from 30,000 feet a 235-year-long relationship, symbiotic relationship, between our two countries sharing responsibility for making a massive continent work to mutual advantage. While the USA's relationship with each country is unique, it can safely be said that both qualitatively and quantitatively, with no country is your relationship as remotely sophisticated as it is with Canada. Obviously, relations with one another aren't domestic, we're both sovereign countries. So the term intermestic has cleverly been coined specifically to describe the US-Canada relationship. 89 of your counties in 14 states share a border with Canada, meaning that more than 1/4 of your US senators and governors have an acute, often constituent-driven interest in the very detail of the relationship. This means many things. Among them, that conducting the relationship is by no means the preserve of the so-called foreign policy professionals. Bottom line, we all have a role to play. But as one of those professionals, I can honestly say that I can imagine nothing more rewarding than spending one's career continuously engaged in trying to improve relations between our two great countries, which is why I've chosen to do just that. Thanks for your attentiveness. Thank you all for coming. If there are any questions about this or anything for that matter, feel free to address them. I was instructed that because of miking system in this room, that I'm supposed to repeat back the question that you ask. That will be an encouragement to you not to go on too long with any of your questions. You can't expect me to remember them, and you probably don't want to hear them twice. And I'm prepared to stay at this for as long as you want to, and I think we have a reception after this. So if you have any questions, please fire away. Hello. Would you mind introducing yourself as well?
I'm Jean from Grand Rapids, and thank you for coming. Very interesting. I remember a lot of that. I guess I showed my age. But anyway, I would like to know when the Canadian government and the Michigan government is going to stop bringing Canadian garbage into our state.
Well.
Canada has millions and millions of acres to put their own garbage.
Gene, it won't surprise you, it's not the first time I've encountered that question. I used to work in the government of Ontario, which is where the garbage comes from, the province of Ontario. And in 2006, the government of Ontario negotiated an agreement with Senators Levin and Stabenow, whereby by the end of 2010, we would no longer send any municipal waste Garbage that came, I'm going to lay it all out. Garbage that came from Ontario was essentially of equal quantity. Municipal waste, the kind of stuff that you put in your trash pail, and so-called ICI, institutional, commercial, and industrial. And it was essentially half and half in volume terms. And the 3-year term of the agreement allowed Ontario, southern Ontario, yes, we've got millions of acres, but in southern Ontario, we're reasonably densely populated, and they needed to open up new dumps. So they did that. You've got to go through environmental assessment processes and so on to open up a dump. They did that. And now all municipal waste, which overwhelmingly had come from Toronto, is dumped in Ontario, and none of it comes to Michigan. Industrial, institutional, and commercial, thank you, ICI, wasn't covered by the agreement, and it continues to come in approximately the same quantity as it used to, not more, not less. The counties that receive this want it. They charge tipping fees, and a certain percentage of the volume, I don't know exactly how it's calculated, but they have never indicated that they don't want it. And so it continues to come, and if your decision makers were to press Ontario leaders again, we can play the same jurisdictional games in Canada that occasionally are done in the United States. This is not a federal government issue. This is a provincial government issue, a municipal government issue, and it's to be worked out between the subnational levels, the state of Michigan and or the counties, and provincial or municipal governments in Ontario. And if there's a will to receive no more, then I'm sure that an agreement will be reached and it will be adhered to, just as the last one was. We always honor our agreements with the United States when we reach them. Another? Sure.
Why is Canada willing to pay for the bridge?
It's we think that it would be better if you were also willing to pay for your share of the bridge. We're not in the habit of subsidizing developed country governments, but we attach such priority to this. The border, as I said, is of vital importance to Canadian viability. A quarter of U.S.-Canada trade crosses the Ambassador Bridge. It's the largest two-way trade relationship in the world, meaning, and because 8 million jobs in the United States and many millions in Canada depend on that two-way trade relationship, you can make the case logically that 2 million Americans and almost as many Canadians depend for their livelihood on that transportation link being viable. If it were to suffer, the Sherman-Minton Bridge that crosses the Ohio River from Louisville into Indiana was found in September to have catastrophic cracks. It was closed, it remains closed. Now there are 2 other bridges conveniently at Louisville, so there's congestion, but they're making it work. There is no other bridge that can carry truck traffic at Detroit. Trucks can't go through the tunnel. They can go 60 miles north to Port Huron, but Port Huron, Sarnia, the Blue Water bridges are essentially at capacity due to the limitations imposed by the plaza size on the US side. Or they can go 350 miles east to Buffalo, to the Peace Bridge. And the other bridges, there are several of them, over the Niagara River. That's a long way to go if you're moving stuff from Windsor to Detroit. It makes things highly inefficient. Car companies, and they aren't the only beneficiaries. I mean, West Michigan business has been extraordinarily supportive. This bridge is often seen as being something that presumably is of interest to Southeast Michigan. Why should anybody else care? The state of Ohio legislature has passed resolutions in support of it. They care, because $32 billion of trade between Ohio goes to Canada each year, and half of it crosses the Ambassador Bridge. And if the bridge were to be closed down, literally a couple of million Americans could find themselves without work for a protracted period. The auto companies talk about the incremental cost of the inventories that they have to carry to guard against congestion, and they encounter congestion right now. So it's so important for us that we're prepared to embark on this extraordinary arrangement whereby we will pay for, well, the private sector will pay for the actual span. Under a public-private partnership, a private sector firm will bring $1 billion, chosen as a result of a tender process by our two governments, will bring $1 billion to the project, and they'll be repaid from tolls. Canada is prepared to pay the estimated up to $550 million that it would cost to connect the bridge to I-75, and I can assure you that that connection will be built a lot quicker than what the Gateway connection has been built, because the owners of the Ambassador Bridge won't have anything to do with the building of it. And we will have, at minimum, insurance. We will have assurance going forward for all of the companies whose business plans rely on moving things one way or the other or both ways, to Canada, to the United States, or both ways. They locate here, they expand here, because they have the certainty that they have transportation options. And we think that it would be devastating to us. We actually think it would be more devastating to Michigan. We've got a back door, the Niagara Peninsula. You can ship things from Ontario to the United States in some other fashion. You can't ship things from Michigan to Ontario and Canada except over the existing 3 bridges. Sault Ste. Marie is pretty far north, and again, the Blue Water's at capacity. So we've made this extraordinary offer, which we kind of hope people would take at face value instead of doubting and being influenced by television commercials that are trying to convince you that, in fact, you have to pay for the bridge, including television commercials just out this week that say it's Governor Snyder's $2 billion bridge, which is $1 billion more than it actually is going to cost, and you have to pay, say the commercials. What does that mean, you have to pay? No, Michigan taxpayer doesn't have to pay. If they mean that the users of the bridge will pay for it in tolls, well, that's what they do now at the Ambassador Bridge. And there's room for both. We're not trying to put the Ambassador Bridge out of business. They will be less profitable. They won't enjoy monopoly profits, but they own the bridge. They'll still be competitive. They'll still send their own trucks over the bridge. Local traffic will still use the bridge. What won't use the bridge are the trucks that are traveling many hundreds of miles and have no reason to enter Detroit or Windsor, and who will benefit for the first time ever from freeway to freeway access. And you won't have 18-wheelers going down city streets in Windsor, Ontario, through 17 traffic lights before they can connect to freeway. It's insane, and yet it is the reality that everybody is forced to deal with until such time as the bridge is built. So Canada made a commitment to Windsor, among other things, that we would alleviate that problem and help them get the traffic off the road, which is why we're prepared. You know, ideally, you would pay your share. You're not in a position to do so. The legislature's having trouble enough getting legislation through that would authorize it without your having to pay anything. I have no illusions that if the bill said you pay, it would be dead on arrival. So we're pragmatic. It's a priority for us. We think it should be a priority for all of the United States. We encounter great support elsewhere. We encounter great support in the state of Michigan. Again, the labor movement, the business community, the agricultural community, newspaper opinion, a lot of support in the legislature. But there are some people that have been intimidated, I fear to say, by this campaign, which has been quite effective, it would seem, in telling untruths and in causing people to pressure their legislators to oppose it. And we hope that well, we call ourselves truth tellers, or we think we're truth tellers. This will cost you nothing. We're prepared to backstop all liability on it. I'm from the Canadian government, take my word for it, and let's move on with the project. You had a question, sir, I think?
I have a question about the tar sands project.
Mm-hmm. We call them oil sands, but
Oil sands.
yeah.
We had a bad spill in the Kalamazoo River this past year. I think people are concerned about the environmental consequences to some of our states. It won't affect Michigan, but some of the other states seem fairly skeptical about it.
Well, in fact, none of the states that it would cross, none of the 6 that would cross it, are skeptical anymore. Nebraska was in October, November, and pressed for rerouting so that it wouldn't cross the sandhills. And TransCanada Pipeline, the proponent, agreed with the state of Nebraska to a 70-mile rerouting. And Nebraska has since passed legislation endorsing it. In fact, they're so supportive now that they've passed legislation to pay for the cost of any supplementary environmental review that would have to be done, because they want to accelerate the project and they're worried that somehow their intervention might have contributed to killing it. This would be a state-of-the-art pipeline. It would have sensors every few feet, unlike the rather aged pipeline that Enbridge had, that much of which has been upgraded since, that broke at Marshall. It remains the case that transporting oil by pipeline is the safest environmentally way of doing so, as in safer than any of the other alternatives. The alternative, of course, will be in the end for us to ship it via boat to China, that has its risks. It is the world's 3rd largest oil supply. The Prime Minister last week, the President called the Prime Minister to explain the decision. He said it's without prejudice, and that TransCanada Pipeline should be willing to, or should consider resubmitting an application. The Prime Minister said last week, a little bit provocatively, maybe, we aren't a northern national park for the United States. We're a sovereign country with an economy that has been doing reasonably well. We happen to be blessed with this reserve. I don't think most people would feel there's any question, if the reserve existed in the United States, that there would be any doubt about it being developed. There might be some opposition, but I think that there would be no presidential permit that would be required in order to transport the oil from the reserve if it existed in the United States. And so my bet would be that it would proceed. For us, I'll be a little bit provocative, a little bit more provocative here. This really reduces, I think, to an issue of where you want to get your oil from. You could reduce your oil consumption. Let's say you could reduce your oil consumption by 25%. That'd be a pretty big improvement over whatever period of time. Today, to reduce your oil consumption by 25%, by the way, in the United States, you'd have to take half of your cars and half of your trucks off the road. So this is not a small order of business, but let's be ambitious. If you reduced your oil consumption by 25%, you would reduce your imports by half, i.e. you still wouldn't have enough domestically to get there. Instead of importing 10 million barrels of oil per day, give or take, you'd import 5 million. You currently import 2 million and change from Canada. We can go to 5 million. Do you want to import it from us, or do you want to import it from somebody else? Not only are there geostrategic advantages, we think, to importing it from us, we've all been holding ourselves hostage to Iran in the last months, or we've been held hostage by Iran, or ever since they attacked your embassy in 1979, there's been a lot of hostage taking, figuratively or metaphorically, insofar as Iran is concerned. Are we inclined to continue to do that forever? Wouldn't it be nice geostrategically to be able to say to Iran, keep your oil? We don't need it. Or to Venezuela, who last week hosted President Ahmadinejad and who last year sent money to Gaddafi to keep killing his people, to tell him to keep his oil. We don't need it. So there's Tom Friedman writes periodically in the New York Times about how the United States, insofar as its energy policy is concerned, finances both sides in the war on terror. You send your money to people who then use it against you, and then you have to send your military to make sure that they don't do damage to you. It becomes quite expensive, to say nothing of lives lost. We promise not to be a military problem for you. We promise not to mount terrorist attacks against you. So you might decide for geostrategic reasons to buy it from us instead. And secondly, since 60 cents of every dollar that you send to Canada for spent on oil reverts to the United States, a far higher proportion than is the case for any energy that you buy from anywhere else in the world, this helps America. So not only are there all those geostrategic advantages, but you enable employment in your country. This pipeline would create 20,000 jobs over the course of 2 years, and some of those would be in Michigan. The energy development that's happening in the oil sands, $160 billion over the next few years, all of it private sector money, will create, using economic modeling, 343,000 jobs in the United States, more than 10,000 of those in Michigan. What's wrong with that picture? Why would you be unattracted to that, is our point of view. And so we would encourage a speedy consideration of Keystone XL, and we'll continue to develop the energy and be your reliable supplier. So you had a question? We are very patient people. We're very hopeful that the bridge will proceed soon. I assume you meant patience with regard to the bridge. Oh, the oil, okay.
The oil.
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister's going to talk next week, the 8th of February, in China with the President of China about oil sales. We can't sell it to them now because we can't deliver it to them now. We have to build a pipeline to the West Coast, or use existing pipelines or twin existing pipelines in Canada and send it to the East Coast. Seems circuitous, but then you'll just spend more time on the high seas. But we can do that and send it that way. It increases the cost. It doesn't make any great deal of sense, but we can do that. If we sign contracts with the Chinese, then that oil is spoken for and isn't available to the United States. We hope that the United States will approve the Trans-Canada application for Keystone XL and do so. I think we've reconciled ourselves to the fact it's not going to happen in the next 13 months. Coincidentally, it will take 13 more months to, I guess now 12 more months to do the environmental review. But we hope that at the end of the 12 months that it will secure the necessary approvals and that it can proceed. And in the meantime, as a sign of good faith, Trans-Canada Pipeline, I think, is going to proceed with the southern part of the project from Cushing, Oklahoma, so as to expand its capacity there for its existing pipeline, which will enable it to deliver the enhanced volumes to Cushing and beyond when the approval does come. Was there another one? Sir.
When are the Maple Leafs going to put a good team on the ice?
I don't cheer for the Maple Leafs, but maybe I would suggest to them that they should aspire to do so by the 1st of January of 2013, because it would appear likely that on that day, January 1st, the Maple Leafs will play the Red Wings in Ann Arbor in front of 110,000 people, and I guess I will have to cheer for the Maple Leafs that day. I grew up, for what it's worth, I grew up in a household, my dad cheered for the Maple Leafs, and therefore I was disposed not to. My grandmother cheered for Detroit because she was absolutely in love with Gordie Howe. And so I have affection, I feel as if I fit in well in coming to Detroit, but I'll be my Canadian chauvinist best on the 1st of January you, sir?
On a more lighter note, would Canada be willing to accept US dollars as toll for the Canadian bridge?
Indeed. Right now, you can cross at any of the crossings using either Canadian or U.S. currency, and we obviously would continue to accept U.S. dollars, which most days are more valuable than Canadian ones, but not every day. Was there? Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Consul General Norton, thank you so much for this presentation today. This is the second time in 30 days you've participated in events at the library and museum. He spoke earlier at the library. They created a little bit of a problem. We do a very nice pen and pencil set, which you already received. So
Yes.
Elaine and I put our heads together, and thanks to the foresight and generosity of Peter Secchia a few years ago, we had Extraordinary Circumstances published.
Oh my.
And we have a few copies of them left. This is a pictorial of David Kennerly's pictures of President Ford.
Tremendous.
We'd like to present this to you tonight.
Thank you very much. I feel embarrassed upon hearing Elaine at the outset say that this was the first lecture of the winter series that, as a Canadian, I somehow didn't deliver winter weather to you. But I'll try to do better when I come back next. And isn't it appropriate? I'm a golden retriever fanatic, and I open the book in the first instance to Gerald Ford and his golden retriever. So how lovely. Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. Again, through the foresight of Peter Secchia, that's signed by Mrs. Ford.
Oh.
So thank you
Wow.
for coming. Thank you for the great partnership we have with the museum and the World Affairs Council. Thank you again for your partnership in this great event. Please join us for a reception in the lobby, and thank everybody for coming on a January night. Take care.
I'll just leave it right here, okay? And it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I'll put it backstage.